Hello tankers and tankettes, and welcome to my first look at the Chrysler K GF, which is this year's Grand Finals Premium. In previous years we've had the 1357, and of course last year was the so-called Black Dog, and now, well, they're doing a heavy tank, an American heavy tank. This one's been in the data files for I think at least the last patch, if not two patches. But clearly they decided this is what they were going to do with it. Maybe they decided that this is what they were going to do with it all along. But as with previous years, with the 1357 and the GF, it was the non-Wargaming League Finals camoed version that we had in. And this is what's now appeared as what they're going to sell. So if you really want it without this camo, you're probably out of luck. You're probably just going to have to mod it if you happen to buy it. So what is it? Well, it's an American premium Tier 8 heavy tank, and it's rather good in a lot of ways. In fact, in some ways, in some stats, it's a bit too good, I would say. Now, just because of the nature of it being a rear-mounted tank, and because of the nature of the armour layout, which I will come to, I would say it's probably less strong overall than something like a Defender or a Patriot, but situationally it can be as strong, if not stronger. So this is one of those tanks where there are certain situations that you aim to get yourself into, because in those situations you know that you are going to be very, very hard to do any damage to. And otherwise, well, you can die very, very quickly. That's possible too. So I'll start off with having a look at the stats, and then we'll have a look at the armor model, and then I've got some gameplay for you. So I've picked out a selection of what I hope are pertinent tanks. There's nothing quite like the Chrysler GF at Tier 8, but there is one tank that it does somewhat resemble, and that's the old, pre-ridiculous buffs VKB at Tier 9. And it is actually really quite similar in its playstyle. It just happens to be a tier lower and with a rather different gun. Basically, with the old VKB, you either wanted to be hull down or side scraping, and you couldn't even really be hull down that effectively because you didn't have particularly good gun depression, and the commander's hatch was more of a weak spot than it is on this thing, which we'll obviously come to when I look at the armor. But in other regards, it's got a roughly equivalent amount of armor as the old VKB. In fact, probably a little better. I think the old VKB didn't have that good side armor. I'm pretty sure it used to have 80mm if we're going that far back, whereas on this it's about 100. But the frontal plate is roughly the same at 152. In fact, the lower front plate's actually slightly better. But you pretty much play it in the same way. You don't trust the frontal armor, you side scrape where possible, and this thing, well, it can even better go hull down than that, but it's still not quite as strong hull down as the Patriot or the T-32. So onto the pertinent stats of this machine. First off, the DPM. These are all the base values, by the way. It's pretty decent, and with a good crew and the relevant equipment, you can get it to be about 2200 plus. So you can get this reload from just about a flat 10 seconds, not quite a flat 10 seconds, but 10.1 seconds. You can get that down to 8 point something seconds quite easily. Not as good as the Patriot, but I mean, it's a 105mm gun. It's the same 105mm that you get on the T-32. This is one of the very few kind of downsides of this tank, is it's that relatively weak penetration, but it does make up for it in other ways. Oh boy, believe me. DPM wise, I mean, there are things that beat it at this tier, and generally those things have better penetration, but it's when you get down to the gun stats that things become a bit more kind of questionable as to how balanced this is. So the big one here is the fact that it has a 1.9 second base aim time. That is ridiculously good for a tank, for a heavy tank with a 105mm gun. That is by far the best of any of these machines. You know, the Oho, which has got better DPM, better pen, and better damage with a 100mm gun, has considerably worse aim time. And everybody else has a good almost half second worse, if not more. That's not quite, that's 0.4 seconds worse. But, you know, considering that a good crew can get this down to about 1.7-ish, you really can just snapshot all day long. And that's compounded by the fact that your dispersion and your bloom stats are also pretty damn good. Now, in the case of your bloom, well, the Tiger II's laser gun, the 105mm that gets, with a worse aim time, but, you know, the other stats are not that far off this. So 0.2 is the equal or the better of a lot of these other tanks. And then particularly the turret traverse bloom, that is by far the clear winner of all these other tanks I've selected. So that does make a difference. That really does. One of the big downsides, one of the few big downsides is, though, that being a rear turret tank, it doesn't have particularly good gun depression. -6 puts it on a par with the KV4, +15 puts it on a par with the Tiger II. So you can't point your gun that far up or down. So having said it's really good hull down, it's really good hull down behind, say, a pile of rubble on flat ground. If you're trying to peek over the crest of a hill, as you might be able to with the T-32 or the Patriot, or the Lerva these days, you're not really going to have so much a good time of it. You're going to have to expose a lot more of your tank to do so. In fact, that kind of hull down fighting over terrain is just going to be really awkward with the rear mounted turret overall. So it's really situationally strong. I mean, the ability to get those shots off without having to aim as long and without having so much bloom to worry about. I mean, the bloom especially is a bit more marginal, to be quite honest, but the aim time, you really will feel that snappy aim time. Yeah, situationally, that makes it very, very strong, but you're always working against that rear-mounted turret. So then we come to the mobility, which is the other kind of questionably balanced aspect of this tank. The speed itself doesn't look so bad. It's identical to the T-32. But then you look at the weight, and then you look at the horsepower, and you start to think, and then you figure out, well, in this case, not figure out, then you read down the column and see that it has a pretty incredible horsepower per ton ratio for a heavy tank. Now, for comparison, I've put the FCM on this list. It really doesn't resemble the FCM in any way, shape or form, but it has a better horsepower per ton ratio than the FCM 50T. Now, obviously, that has a much better top speed, but this just has... I don't know, it just has that ability to go everywhere at 35. And 35's not that slow for a heavy tank. 35's actually pretty decent. And you consider the other 1200 horsepower engined tanks, you know, the VK1001P is literally twice as heavy. And the KV4's not that far off. You know, the OHO is over twice as heavy. So, yeah, that's ridiculously good, and the 1.9 second aim time is ridiculously good. I was basically going everywhere at 35 kph. It's a little bit silly. The terrain resistances only compound that. The VK actually has better terrain resistances, I think, to maybe kind of compensate for just how big and heavy this tank is. It's fairly sluggish otherwise, but yeah, I was just accelerating up to 35 kph and then just staying there, and that is really powerful for a heavy tank. You're not really going to slow down that much. It's also got, on top of that, pretty good traverse stats. So you see the turret traverse is, like, that's alright. 24 is comparable with the other American heavies on this list, and it's by far not the best on this list, but it's not penalised particularly in turret traverse. And then in hull traverse, well, actually it does beat most of these tanks, only the FCM is better. So there's not that many downsides to this tank. The principal ones are its rear turret mounted, which is just, you know, that just makes for an awkward playstyle at times, that makes certain bits of certain maps really work against you, and it doesn't have a whole lot of pen, except this is only the AP pen, and it carries 100 rounds of ammo because it's a really big tank. So if I look at the premium, in fact, let's see if it compares to if it's the same premium as the T-32. I'm going to have to redo this here, aren't I? Yeah, for some reason tanks.gg, there we go. No, I didn't want the Patriot. What are you doing, tanks.gg? Okay, technical difficulties. Bear with me for a second. So here we are. Yeah, that for some reason took hitting refresh a couple of times. Even your APCR is better than the T32. I really don't know why. So the fact that you've got that 198 base pen doesn't even matter that much, because you could just load up so much APCR with that huge ammo capacity and with your pretty good DPM. Yeah, you basically have the pen of a tier 10 heavy tank with very good armor. I don't think this is particularly balanced, to be quite honest. Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's as bad as the Defender in terms of how much power creep it represents, but it definitely represents power creep. And I think it's only the fact that it's a rear-mounted tank that maybe makes it less strong than the Defender overall. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really like this policy of let's make all new premiums just power creep the old premiums and just the same tier tanks generally. I don't think that's a good policy, but it might just be that's where we've hit in the life cycle of World of Tanks. And most of the new tanks that will come out from this time forward will just be a trickle of new premiums, and so therefore let's make them, you know, a bit too good for their tiers in some cases. So lastly, before we get to the gameplay, I'm going to go over the armour, and I think the armour is at least the area where this thing is reasonably balanced. This is a very situationally dependent tank, as I've said. If you can get to somewhere where you can side scrape and people can't just rush you, then you can be really powerful indeed, especially if you decide to then just start spamming the APCR. But there are some weaknesses to this. Now, if I bring up the collision view, we can see the actual armour outline, and well, it's got a very soft top and relatively soft sides and rear. But having said relatively soft sides and rear, this is still 100mm of side armour, which is definitely good enough for side scraping, and the fact that it's a rear-mounted design means that it's especially well suited to that. Now, you have to be careful with your angling, and I will show you the live view in a second, because you can't over-angle with 100mm of side armour. That will get you fairly well spanked if you do that, and I did have that lesson given to me fairly sharply on a number of occasions. The frontal armour is probably the biggest weakness of this. If you're charging into the battle expecting to bounce all the shots like you can in a Defender, you're going to be rather disappointed. Now, the 152, as I've said, is around what the old VK had, and the old VK, you really couldn't ever rely on the frontal armour. You could only count on it bouncing relatively low pen, lower tier guns, and that's rather the case with this as well. I suspect the angling on this upper front plate is better than the old VK. It's a steeper angle, but it's still 150mm, which means that even with good angling, you're only going to get sort of 250 to 260. And I say only, it's just at tier 8, you can meet even plenty of tanks that will pen that. Now, even though the lower front plate is a thicker plate, it still gives around the same effectiveness. And I'll actually flick over to the live view. So, if you're looking head on, in fact, if you're looking, like if you're firing up at this plate, it becomes relatively weak indeed. But let's say you're sort of more or less on the level. About the strongest you'll get just looking at somebody is around 240, and it's around 220 to 230 with the lower plate. So if you're on flat ground, you want to angle, but you don't want to over angle, because suddenly this side armor becomes very vulnerable. So that really does limit how much you can angle the front plate, and even heavily angled, well, we're getting a maximum of around 270 on the lower front plate and around 260 on the outside edge of that plate. But this near side angle is about 220 to 230. So, you know, same tier heavies can punch through that. Same tier tank destroyers can easily punch through that. So you don't want to really show the lower front plate if you can help it. You want to basically goad people into shooting at the side armor. And that was a big adjustment with the VKB when they changed it, is suddenly you weren't trying to get people to shoot at your angled side armor anymore. You were basically sticking out your front armor at an angle and watching as all the shots bounced helplessly off. Anyway, so that's the hull armor. The turret armor is a rather different story. The turret armor is very good. I have been penned through the turret, but that was by a tier 10 medium. and it was just regular AP, but even so, there are plenty of higher tier guns that will be able to punch through this. But generally speaking, the turret armor is the most reliable armor you've got, so that's what you should be exposing to the enemy. You should be trying to hide this and only show this. You do have a commander's hatch that might be an issue, but you know, if you can side scrape on this side, it's fine, it's gravy. They don't have the commander's hatch to shoot at. If you're on the other side, well, there's a better chance that they can, but it's still relatively well protected. It's 178 mil, just about, as you can see. And towards the edges, it's not quite guaranteed to bounce, but like this is probably going to bounce outside of this relatively small middle zone here. And even that is rather decent effective armor. That's kind of like 220 to 230 mil of armor. So you need at least sort of IS-3 levels of penetration to have a chance of hitting that. There are some tanks that if they meet this and it's hull down, they're going to have to load premium if they want to have any chance of penning that. So it's very strong hull down. But I would still say the T-32 and the Patriot and maybe the T-34 are stronger because they have the extra gun depression. So having said all that, I think we should get on to some gameplay and we can see how this thing actually does perform in battle. So the first clip I've got for you is part of this game on Windstorm. In fact, it's most of this game on Windstorm. It was a relatively fast match, not quite a 3-minute battle, but not a long drawn out one by any means. And as you can see, there's not a lot of allied tanks here. I've come to the usual heavy spot, and I'm actually basically side-scraping more or less. I'm not actually side-scraping off a building, but I'm angling out so that I only expose my my side armor. Now I didn't talk about specific angles, but it's pretty tight. You can't really angle more than sort of 18 to 19 degrees. Any more than that and you start losing that auto bounce angle, and you're going to start having higher pen guns, sort of 200 plus millimeter guns, go through your armor with relative ease. So you have to keep a really quite steep angle on this thing to maintain those bounce zones. But because you've got that rear mounted turret, well, that works in your favour. But because it's such a comparatively tight angle, you still have to back out relatively far. It's not like the VKB these days where you can angle quite far, or even something like the KV4 where you can angle out quite far and still be assured of getting those bounces. Now I'm aware the T10 to my south is in trouble, and it looked honestly, because there's a big mass of enemy tanks in the town, it looked honestly like they might just try and push across. And they are making a move to the south there. So I thought we might be in trouble, to be quite honest. But, well, this is one of those games where what you think the enemy might, the enemy team might do, and what they actually do are going to be two different things. So I've not done a huge amount of damage so far. Most of it was to the IS-3 early on, but that Super Pershing there is not at a great angle himself, so I was able to get one through the axle. However, the second shot unfortunately went into the ground instead. Even with the really relatively good accuracy of this thing, I mean, we're still not talking the accuracy of the Tiger II, but that aim time coupled with the side armor, I mean, this thing is a champion side scraper. It really is. You can just pull out, do the less than 2 seconds aim, and then plop back into safety. So you don't even have to expose your side armor for that long. You can really afford to take those snapshots. And if you completely, you know, donk a shell into the ground, it doesn't matter because you've got so many shells that are left in your tank, and your rate of fire is good enough that you're going to have them again relatively quickly. So they've sort of pushed across, except it doesn't matter at this point. Our team in the north has basically swept round, and now we've got these remaining tanks more or less surrounded in the town area. So it is just mopping up. So that's my first kill. A little bit more damage. If I'm lucky I might get some more, but this enemy lurver is trying some side scraping himself. I was a little wary of going forwards at this point and maybe giving my side to the IS-3, but I really needn't have. I mean, the IS-3 and the Lerva that are across the bridge are going to be occupied with the Allied tank, so I probably could have been a bit more aggressive about trying to maybe get up closer to get some damage, and instead, well, I'm just playing the side-scraping game with this Lerva. So this particular game, like, I picked this out because it really shows off the side scraping, and the full-length game that I've got as well will also show off the side scraping, because that's where this thing really shines. But it's more that even though this was a somewhat mediocre game damage-wise, I still got quite a lot of bounced damage. Now I'm onto the APCR at this point because with the 198 pen against the Lerva, even with a bit of his front plate showing, the 198 is not going to do it. However, 260 pen, yeah. So there we go, there's the final kill. So the APCR, totally unnecessary against the Emil, but it was for the Lerva. It's just the Emil happened to pop out at an opportune time. So a Spartan medal and a steel wall, and what was that at the end? Well, we'll see on the next screen what that was damage-wise. Any second now. 1800 damage, and second place on the team with just over 1,000. But it was over 3,000 bounced damage, which is, you know, that's not bad. That's not bad at all. So you can see there, yeah, 11 shots that hit me, 11 bounces. I think I had one that went in the track for a total of 3.6k. So this thing, yeah, if you can side scrape and people are unable to just push through you, it is incredibly strong. However, if you're on flat ground, or even if you have enemies that are slightly below you, it's much less so. Now this is just a clip. This is basically by far the quickest I managed to get myself killed in this thing, and you're going to see exactly what happened. Now this is a pair of IS-3s below me, and I'm angling a bit. I get bounced on the turret, but even at that angle, okay, no, that still penned me. So I'm going for an axle shot, but it only takes his tracks off. And kind of back up. No, once again, into the lower front plate, still penned at an angle. And this is all just with AP. It's not like these guys are spamming APCR. And there's another one into the lower front plate. Now this is basically the worst possible scenario, with tanks that are below you and level with your lower front plate able to fire at it. But that just goes to show you that the frontal armour, you cannot get overconfident with this thing. This is by far a better defensive tank than an offensive tank on level ground, provided you've got some cover to use. So in that kind of situation, I mean, it was just, I think, a little unlucky that I didn't do any damage to those IS-3s, but you saw how easily they were able to kill me in return. They just hit the lower front plate over and over again. And with the angling, even with the angling, that only would have had maybe kind of 200 to 220 effective armour. So positioning is absolutely key. This is not an overpowered tank on the flat ground. This is a tank that really absolutely depends on getting to a good position where it cannot be winkled out before it will become OP in any way, shape or form. So this is why I think it's more balanced than the Defender and more balanced than the Patriot. Those are kind of the stronger all-rounder tanks. But if you give this thing the opportunity to get where it wants to go, then yeah, it's really good. Now I think that was an upper front plate bounce. That must be an IS-3 that's at their cap. Not entirely sure what that WZ was thinking, but you know, I'll take it. And although there are some tanks on the enemy team I do have to be wary of, this is the tier 10 match. This is looking fairly comfortable for the time being. There's allies with me, so I know I won't be just rushed. And even if some of those nasty tanks turn up, it's unlikely that they'll be able to completely get the drop on me, just with the really good mobility of this thing. I can turn my tank around relatively quickly. So there's that camping IS-3. The enemy team seems to be playing very defensively. We've seen some tanks spotted to the south, but they're not contesting the town area at all here on Fisherman's Bay. We've actually got light tanks that have pushed up the 1-2 line, although I'm not sure if the 1390 on our team has said in the chat yet, but he'd managed to flip himself unfortunately. But even so, with just a couple of tank destroyers and the 252 over on that flank, the enemy team's not pushing. They're just sitting in a defensive position, and they're doing exactly the same on this side. So we're moving up because there's nothing stopping us moving up. And bear in mind, most of the enemy team is still alive. They've only lost 2 light tanks. So this was super campy and super defensive. So if I can stay in the town area, that's all good. And if I can find somewhere to side scrape off, that's even better. And bear in mind, where the enemy team is on the other side, that's got houses that I can use as well. So this is a good map for me. Being on the other side of the map would not be so good, but there's maybe still a rock or two that I could use. So for some reason this T-62A is coming down here alone. And at this point I thought, okay, I might take a bit of damage. And I'm trying to keep my angle here, but the reason why I'm putting my tank out this way instead of side scraping is it's easier to pull back when your tank is this way inclined. That kind of made sense in my head. But as it turns out, the T-62A is not very good anyway. So, yeah. And you can see I'm actually able to get my front round with relative ease because he got tracked when ramming into me, and so that's fine. I didn't even have to worry particularly about him getting my side armor. So all through that engagement, I took 1 hit. And I think that's just because he wasn't playing very well, to be quite honest. But even if he'd been playing much better than that, I probably still would have been relatively fine. It's the point where somebody in a tier 10 medium starts reaching for the premium ammo. Well, at that point your armor's not much use at all. So some easy shots at this IS-3, and we might as well take them. So this is all, this is all very nice in terms of the damage count. I'm already up to 2,500 with 1,200 blocked damage, and we're not even done yet because there's still all of these enemy tanks that are defending their base. Now the T-95 is the only one that's a real roadblock. A bit of a mistake there, by the way. I don't know why I went for the side of a turret on a T-34. It was a bit of a chancy shot when I had, literally any hull to shoot at, but there you go. I don't make the same mistake twice, and that's my 3rd kill. So now it's just the 2 tier 10s who are completely overwhelmed. There's a T-49 running around somewhere, and everything else is pretty much over on the other side. So really, this is pretty comfortable. There's a lot of allies with me. These guys are playing defensive, so I don't have to worry about being rushed. And it's just more, competing for damage at this point. And this is absolutely where this thing is strongest, surrounded by allies, so you can't rush it, and able to side scrape. So that one went in the tracks. Won't count towards my bounce damage, of course, but that was still an IS-7 premium shell, so, sure, why not? It's not doing any damage to me, I don't care. However, I'm going to struggle a bit myself here. I did try my luck with the AP just because I wanted to see how well I do. But despite multiple hits on these cupolas, yeah, this is where the 198 pen is not that good, and it almost forces you to reach for the premium shells. And it's kind of the same on the T-32 as well. There are situations where you'll meet enemies that you just can't really cope with your regular penetration. Yeah, that was just a waste of a shell. So you just are absolutely forced to go for the premium, which kind of sucks in a way, but there's not like those tanks that have lower pen rather, don't generally have other things going for them. What I don't understand though is why this has better APCR penetration than the T-32. That is just flat out power creep. There's no defense for that. There's no reason for that. It's the same gun. And for some reason they've decided it's got a different APCR, a different, better APCR shell. Because reasons. Because power creep reasons. Because, because we want to sell premiums reasons. And quite honestly, it's reaching the stage where I'm not sure, if we get another one of these where it's I mean, I don't want to say it's completely blatant. It's less blatant than the Defender and the Patriot, and to a lesser extent the Liberté. The Liberté at least has got a far weaker commander's hatch to shoot at. I don't know. I almost might just feel disinclined to give Wargaming the time of day, even though obviously it's going to cost me in terms of views, because a lot of people go looking for reviews of tanks in particular. So we're on to the APCR. I need the APCR just to hit this guy's weak spots. The shot in his side armor I might well have penned with AP, but you can see even with the T95, like that big 155mm gun, firing APCR, still bounced off the side armor of this thing because I've got the angle, so I really don't have to worry. So it's just kind of like RNG that's preventing me getting this kill at this point. That last one went slightly off centre, so even at this relatively close range I wasn't able to get him. And I actually was partially loading an HE shell for that last bit of health, but even that might not have been enough. So with the death of the final T49, there we go, we've won, and that was apparently an ace mastery, but of course nobody's driving these things at the moment, apart from the test account, so it's not really anything to brag about especially. But the actual XP result will end up being rather good, because I was damaging higher tier tanks and getting spotting on higher tier tanks. I think the T62A especially, that would have given me a big chunk of that 1400 XP. So yeah, 3.7k damage done, and again over 3000 damage bounced, and because I did a pretty decent amount of damage, even with the APCR I fired, still 35k profit. If I hadn't fired that APCR, I would have made more. And this is one of the, like, having said you can just fill your tank up with APCR, if you had 100 APCR shells, I shudder to think how much that would cost. And even just firing that amount of APCR that I did, you know, that was still relatively costly. So, you know, that's really the only counterbalancing factor of having all that APCR, is how many credits do you want to spend. And if you're willing to spend all the credits and you don't care about making money in this thing, then you could just, you know, you could roll around with your tier 10 levels of penetration and it would be ridiculous. And as it is, well, it's situationally ridiculous. But I think it's still, I don't know, I just don't approve. I mean, I know my approval means nothing to Wargaming, but the direction they're going in, the direction they have been going in, I don't think it's a good one. And I would like to see more premiums that have a more balanced feel to them, rather than the ones where it's like, well, there's this new premium, and oh look, it has the best in tier, you know, aim time, or the best in tier horsepower per ton ratio, or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know what to say. I mean, people will go and buy this thing, you'll see them around, they'll be very annoying when they're side scraping, and all you'll really be able to do is load the premium and try and pen them through the turret, because you won't have a lot of other options. So, I don't know, you know, like, sure, it's a good tank, it's a bit strong, some people will find the fact that it's rear mounted off-putting, but overall it definitely well fits in with the trend of the higher tier prems that we've been having. And I don't like that trend. I don't think it's a good trend. So I don't know. That's my takeaway with this tank, is it's fitting in with a trend and not in a good way. Not a good trend at all. So hopefully you found this video useful, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.